All right, welcome back for the Unit 8 notes. Unit 8, of course, being aquatic and terrestrial pollution. This is going to be our 10th video on the 10th section for waste reduction methods. We'll talk about some of the things we can do to reduce waste. So, the amount of waste that's produced by a nation has a direct correlation with the GDP, which is a gross domestic product, which can essentially be the wealth of a country. So, municipal waste generation on this graph, you can see the correlation here. As you have more wealthy GDPs, more wealthy countries, that's the y-axis, you're going to see higher amounts of municipal waste. And this comes from the World Bank. So just a reminder what municipal solid waste, or MSW, is. It's refuse collected by municipalities from households, small businesses, and institutions. This is trash, right? So we ask ourselves a pretty interesting question. What really brought us to this? What has created us to become a throwaway society? One of the things, obviously, is industrialization. There's newer materials, and we have better access to different energy sources. There's also been a cultural shift where we prioritize convenience and speed, and we're actually able to outsource and externalize costs, so we don't have to think about it as much because we're able to outsource those costs. So, how does our industrialization lead to developing countries increasing their MSW? Well, we export our manufacturing and our disposal. We actually manufacture, for most of the items that we use in an industrialized society, the manufacturing is not done in the United States, for example. So we don't actually deal with the manufacturing, and we also typically dispose in a different country as well. You know, your typical landfill obviously is going to deal with a lot of your waste, but all of those, when we talked about different types of waste and we looked at those things that had hazardous chemicals where they say, hey, don't bring this to the landfill. You've got to dispose of this in a different way. You can bring it to us, but we have to deal with it differently. So you can't just throw it in your dumpster. What do they do with those chemicals? For the most part, they export it so that it can be dealt with somewhere else. So the total waste is 251 million tons, okay? That can be broken down into paper and paperboard, which is 27% of all of our waste. Food waste is 14%. Yard trimmings are 14%. Plastics are 13%. Metals are 9%. Rubber, leather, and textiles, clothing, 9%. Wood is 6%. Glass is 5%. And then other is 3%. So you can actually look at this waste and you can break this down and talk about, well, what is, compostable? What is actually going to break down in a relatively shorter amount of time? Well, paper and paperboard, food waste, and yard trimmings, which is nice because these are our top 3 sources of waste. So they will break down over time. Plastics, metals, rubber, leather, and textiles, these 3 don't really break down in a very quick period of time. Wood does, and glass does not. And then other, of course, being other. Now, when we look at plastics, plastic waste is 32 million tons. You can do the math. 13% of 251 is 32. I hope it is. This can actually be broken down into other sources. The sources of plastics, the different types of plastics. We have low linear, low carbon polyethylene, polypropylene, higher density polyethylene, then polyethylene terephthalate. Oh, good. Polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, and then other sources of plastic. Now, the reason we break plastics into their own different categories is because certain plastics can be recycled and certain plastics can't. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But just note, paper and paperboard is the highest number of waste for us. Food waste being number 2. Plastics is a huge one. So how much is recycled? Okay, when we look at how much of our MSW is recycled, 75% of that is food and paper waste. Okay, so paper, glass, plastic, and metal. A third of our waste is recycled, keeping in mind that 75% is paper and food waste. Now, recycling rates in the United States since 1960, we look at the 60s and the 70s as being kind of our environmental, the green revolution here. We actually saw a huge rise in aluminum. And then the aluminum rates have dropped since then. Paper, of course, is being more and more recycled as we continue on. Glass is being recycled at much higher levels than it used to be. And then plastics, the reason that they weren't on the map before 1980 is because they weren't in high use before 1980. But this number right here is 0. Keep that in mind. It's not the bottom of the graph. It's right here. And we are continually moving towards using more and recycling more and more. But, we're looking at like 63% in 2010 of our paper was being recycled, whereas about, 8% of plastic was being recycled. So we'll talk about some of the R's, right? The first R is to reduce. This is the best thing we can do as far as dealing with municipal solid waste is to reduce. If we use less of our source, we reduce the use of potential waste in the early stages of our design and manufacturing. So when we're designing things, when we're manufacturing things, we should always think about how can we use less of the sources to make these products. There's a great book called The Buy Nothing, Get Everything Plan, which is discover the joy of spending less, sharing more, and living generously. But using less things, buying less, and using everything. Then the second R is reuse, right? By reusing items, we can increase the residence time in the system. It's better if it doesn't require a lot of additional energy, which would be considered upcycling. So here's some examples. Use your old cups as holders for different items. You can use your tires to plant your plants. Those could be your planters. And then, of course, there's things you can do to reuse your old light bulbs. You can use your old milk cartons as decorations. So there's a lot of things we can do in reusing. The idea of reusing is that you're not doing a lot of energy to reuse it. You're just upcycling it. You're using it for another purpose. Recycling is where we convert the raw materials back into the raw materials where they can be used to then produce newer products. There's open loop recycling, which is where you convert materials into a new product. So here's an example of open loop cycling. So you have the petrochemical feedstock that create PET bottles where they're manufactured. They're used by consumers. Now some of them, of course, are disposed in the landfill. But if they are recycled, they can be recovered and processed and manufactured into fibers using more petrochemical feedstock to have another use from consumers. So 5 2-liter PET bottles make enough fiber fill for 1 ski jacket. So you actually might see that if you're buying clothing, it might actually say on it, hey, this is used sustainably. We've reused plastic to make this item. And this is that process where you actually can manufacture fibers using those old bottles. Now, of course, this does require a lot of energy, and it will still produce some waste. If just reusing is considered upcycling, recycling is downcycling because you're going down the process. You're not going to get as much of it. And overall, you're going to see a degradation in the quality. Now, here's some examples of maybe not so great uses. Single-use plastic, of course, but these are just some of those examples of just ridiculous amounts of waste. Why? Really? Imagine that you buy a new charger, a new wall charger, and it comes in that giant box for that. A giant Amazon box with another big box inside of it with 2 small bottles. You've ordered something on Amazon and it's come like this, and you just feel discouraged. So this is an example. Somebody bought some ink for their printer, and each one of those little ink cartridges came in a big box. Why would you wrap a banana in plastic? It doesn't even make any sense. Oh, there you go. That'll keep it fresh. So, closed loop cycling is a little bit different, where we can continue to use and reuse. Benzene and other petroleum are used to create carpet fibers, and those carpet fibers are then used in carpet. And then you can recycle carpet. You can have it collected and recycled to make new carpet. So closed loop recycling is where you break down the raw materials and then remake the same product. So remember, open loop recycling. Open loop is where you convert it into a new product. Closed loop is where you use it to create the same product. So here's some recycling pros. We're going to look at some of the pros of recycling. Obviously, you're going to consume fewer raw materials. You're going to reduce the amount of the use of energy in the manufacture and processing of those products. When you're creating products, you do use energy and you do have to process and manufacture. By recycling, there's less need of disposal, so you don't actually need as many landfills. But overall, it will reduce the amount of pollution and emissions. Of course, there are always cons. It's not cost effective. And that is, of course, when we think about, the real world, we have to think about, can we make this cost effective? If it's not cheap, it's not going to be something that's going to be done. They're usually going to have unsafe locations where they recycle because of contaminants and emissions. You have to remember that a lot of these products contain chemicals that can harm people. Usually the new products that are made are not as high in quality and they're not very durable. It's hard to implement this on a larger scale and in certain regions. There's a lot of plastics out there that just aren't recyclable. And if they're not recyclable, you can't recycle them. All in, one efficient. I don't even know why did I write that? Why is that there? And the biggest thing here is it's a false sense of security. We think of recycling and we feel good about it, right? Because recycling, hey, I'm doing my part. In reality, you have to remember that this is not the ultimate thing. If you're buying plastic bottles and thinking, well, I'll recycle these, so it'll be fine. Whereas you don't have to buy plastic bottles. You can buy products that don't use materials that need to be recycled. So the hierarchy of preferred solid waste management strategies. So obviously the greatest amount of waste is landfilled. Then we look at conversion technologies. Then we look at recycling. And then we look at the source reduction. We don't really use source reduction as the main amount of waste reduction. The paradigm shift comes in the 21st century where we have to start looking at, we have to use less. Reduce source reduction. Then we can recycle what we've used because it can be used and composted. Then we can look at converting it. And then the very last thing we should be thinking about is putting it in the ground and landfilling it. If we're not using as much, we're not going to have to worry about putting as much into the ground and disposing of it. Now, you've probably heard of composting. I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but essentially where you create organic matter, also known as humus. You control the conditions to decompose organic materials, and you get an organic rich material that enhances your soil structure, your CEC, and your fertility. Now, in order to compost well, you have to make sure that there's a good carbon to nitrogen ratio so that you can boost the microbial activity. You want to layer dry materials with wet materials, so leaves and grass with kitchen scraps. The rotation and aeration is done to provide oxygen. If you do it anaerobically, like in a landfill, you're going to produce methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Some of the drawback, of course, is that it can increase the amount of odor and it will encourage rodents. So these are some actual, so that these first ones are like reusing products to make compost bins. You don't have to do that much to make one, or you can buy a composter like this one. I actually made this exact one right here. This isn't mine, but this is what I designed it off of. I used an old water barrel. I think it was used to hold soda syrup of some type, and so I had to clean it really well to get all the Mountain Dew out of it, and it just broke. It was terrible. This is a cool design, and I just couldn't make it work for me, which was a bummer. But I like pile composting as long as it's not too big of a pile so that you can rotate it and aerate it. If you don't aerate your compost pile, that's what causes more and more odor problems, so something to keep in mind. And we look at hazardous waste when we're talking about waste. Hazardous waste can be liquid, solid, or gas that are harmful to humans or the environment. Okay, that's what makes hazardous waste hazardous. This is paint, batteries, pesticide solvents, cleaning agents, varnishes, and automotive fluids. These are hazardous wastes. These are things that you have to make sure that you don't just throw into the trash. Now, ultimately, there are no real good options when we deal with hazardous waste. They usually treat it chemically first, but reduction is the best way. So hazardous waste center would actually have you put certain wastes into certain containers, and then they have to deal with it in a special way. Now, CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, was put in place. It's the Superfund Act. We think we talked about it, but maybe not. But it puts taxes on chemical and petroleum industries. It funds the cleanup of non-operating hazardous waste sites. So the problem here, and we'll watch a video on this in class about a case that happened in New York where essentially there was just this huge hazardous waste area that wasn't being dealt with, and the Superfund Act kind of deals with it. It puts the EPA in charge of making sure that it is cleaned up properly. Reno has a Superfund site near the marina. Now, this authorizes the federal government to respond immediately to the release of hazardous substances. Some of the landfill mitigation strategies, obviously burning waste for energy and reducing volume, and then restoring a habitat to be used for parks. So this would be before, and this is the after, but just properly, reusing an area, putting a playground on top of a landfill so that it can still be used, and really just, restoring the habitat. So that's going to be the end of our 10th video. Our next video will be all about sewage treatment.